Hey guys, tonight we journey behind the velvet curtain of the Castilian court to uncover a truly peculiar secret. Queen Isabella of Castile banned mirrors from her private chambers, and tonight, you're going to find out why. You pad softly across the hand-knotted rugs of her bedroom, flickering candlelight bouncing off gold-threaded tapestries, but not a single pane of reflective glass. No vanity table glimmers in the corner. No mirror above the hearth. Just you, and that creeping feeling that someone or something is watching anyway. You probably won't survive this journey with your sanity intact. But hey, that's part of the fun. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it by you? I love seeing how far we drift together each night. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You slip into Queen Isabella's chambers in the winter of 1498. The stone walls are cold, the silence thick, and the guards outside know better than to peer into this particular room for too long. Candle smoke lingers in spirals. And there it is again, that glaring absence. No mirror. You approach a linen-draped console, expecting a polished bronze or obsidian shard. Nothing. Not even the beveled glass common in late medieval Spanish nobility. It's as though reflection itself has been outlawed. The mirror ban isn't in any official decree. It's enforced quietly, socially, through chambermaids, ladies-in-waiting, architects who know not to suggest mirrored closets. Isabella herself has made the ban explicit in private but never public. That's the first clue. Whatever prompted this decision wasn't about fashion, it was personal. One visitor to the court, a Venetian diplomat, reportedly asked for a looking glass to check his powdered wig. He was handed a bowl of water. "In Castile," said the servant, "we let the soul see only ripples." Now, here's a mainstream historical fact. Queen Isabella, wife to Ferdinand II of Aragon, was one of the key sponsors of Christopher Columbus and the driving force behind Spain's Reconquista, retaking the Iberian Peninsula from Moorish control. She was devout, commanding, and uncompromising, but even her most loyal chroniclers were baffled by her aversion to mirrors. A quirky tidbit floats from an old nursemaid's journal. Isabella once insisted that her newborn child not be shown a mirror before age 3, fearing it would fracture the soul. Historians still argue whether the ban was spiritual, psychological, or symbolic. Was it a traumatic experience? A moral stance against vanity? A fear of demonic presence through reflected surfaces? You feel it now, don't you? That unease. The idea that reflection isn't passive, it's active. It stares back. A draft moves through the room. You glance toward an armoire, carved with grapevines and serpents. Nothing shimmers. Just dark wood. And still. You wonder if your own shadow is quite alone. You follow Isabella back through time now, her tiny feet echoing against the stone tiles of Madrigal de los Altos Torres, where she was born, and you're behind her, just a shadow, as she moves quietly through a convent corridor barefoot, cautious, eyes flicking left to right like she expects something to leap from the walls. She's 7, then 9, then 12, growing taller but never quite shaking that look of dread that clings to her brow like a misplaced crown. Her early life is nothing you'd envy. Court politics swirl around her, thick with betrayal and whispers of illegitimacy. Her half-brother Henry IV holds the throne, but everyone mutters that he shouldn't. You watch Isabella learn early that trust is a fragile thing, about as sturdy as a spun glass mirror in the hands of a drunk bishop. Religion consumes her upbringing, and not just the pleasant Sunday sermon kind. No, you're talking demon-scorched soul levels of devotion. Her confessors preach fire and brimstone, her tutors drive home the dangers of temptation, pride, and excessive grooming. Beauty, in particular, is a spiritual trap, a shiny apple from the serpent's hand. You watch as young Isabella begins flinching from her reflection in holy water. She pauses at the baptismal font and doesn't look in. She drinks with her eyes averted. The nuns who guide her comment on her modesty, but there's something deeper, something closer to fear. Here's a historical fact: Isabella was raised not by her parents, but under the watch of a deeply religious circle of courtiers and clergy. Her father died when she was just 3. Her mother, Queen Isabella of Portugal, suffered a mental breakdown and withdrew from public life. That left young Isabella vulnerable and subject to intense religious shaping from early on. And this wasn't your average Sunday school curriculum. Spanish Catholicism in the 15th century had roots in asceticism, mysticism, and yes, some pretty wild superstitions. A fringe tidbit pops up in an old Dominican scroll. One monk wrote that mirrors were slippery veils, capable of revealing not just faces, but layered selves, including the sinful double that dwells inside. For a young girl being taught to fear sin in every hidden nook of her soul, you can imagine how unnerving it might be to see even a flicker of yourself looking back from silvered glass. Historians still argue whether Isabella's fear began with doctrine alone or if something personal happened to her. There's no record of a single traumatic mirror incident in her early years, but there are gaps. Whole weeks of her upbringing are undocumented. It's possible that a mirror once showed her something she wasn't meant to see or made her feel something she couldn't unfeel. You glide with her to her private prayer chamber. One candle burns. You hear the scratch of parchment. She's writing down psalms, maybe penning a confession. And near the edge of the desk, you spot a small bronze hand mirror. It's turned face down. Dust outlines its curved edge. She hasn't touched it in weeks. You feel the tension, a child afraid of something invisible, something looming behind her eyes. And now that fear has aged. Grown into policy. Into royal decree by design. But you're only at the beginning. We still don't know what really snapped. You stand quietly in the vaulted hallway of the ALC Tsar of Segovia now, tracing the curve of Isabella's trajectory as she moves through adolescence into full political awareness. You're drifting with her through the candlelit corridors where secrets turn the air thick, and the whispers of noble families coil tighter around her ambitions. Every glance, every small gesture, becomes a power move. She's not just surviving court life anymore, she's playing it. You trail her past the cloistered courtiers who underestimate her, watching as she deciphers their little games like a girl solving riddles on parchment soaked in wine. The throne isn't hers yet, but she's already moving pieces across the board. You see her visit with Alvaro de Luna's widow, you listen in on conversations with bishops who flinch when she speaks plainly, and every calculated pause she takes feels like thunder behind a closed door. Isabella's rise to power in Castile wasn't inevitable, it was earned, carved from hesitation and doubt, and sealed with marriages she refused. That alone? Historical fact. She declined at least 3 politically advantageous proposals before choosing Ferdinand of Aragon, not just for love, though she'd claim it, but for strategic alliance. Together, they would later form the dual monarchy that would birth modern Spain, but you're not there yet. The throne itself was contested by multiple factions, with Queen Isabella forced to negotiate, justify her claim, and battle the perception of weakness tied to her sex. And through this path of fiery diplomacy and sharpened resolve, one thing remained consistent: no mirrors. Still none. In fact, you begin to notice something subtle. Reflections are avoided not only in her chambers but in correspondence. Isabella rarely speaks of physical appearance. Her letters to nobles are full of moral instruction, religious reflection, military plans. But never physical reflection. A fringe detail you hear from a Castilian herald: the queen once rejected a tapestry design that included angels looking into crystal pools. She found it unsettling, a word that doesn't exactly scream royal aesthetic critique. Historians still argue whether her mirror ban was part of a broader symbolic rejection of superficial politics or something more private. You lean close now as she drafts her alliance terms, watching her quill scratch lines that would reshape a continent. But her fingers never brush a polished ring, never glance down into a gilded ink tray. Not a flicker. Power, in Isabella's view, didn't need confirmation from a reflection. That realization tugs at you. Because as she moves closer to the throne, she's also constructing a world where the self is unseen and perhaps unknowable. You're sitting on a narrow velvet cushion now as a gold-framed Bible rests on the lectern beside Isabella, sunlight pressing through narrow cathedral windows that somehow never reflect. The mood in her chambers has shifted from ambition to anxiety, not politically spiritually. You feel her deepening discomfort with mirrors emerge not just as a superstition but as a moral dilemma. It starts with an idea that's barely whispered: mirrors as instruments of vanity, yes, but worse portals of temptation. You remember the friars preaching about Lucifer's pride, how he loved his own beauty too much, and the cautionary tales of Eve seeing herself before the fall. That discomfort grows inside Isabella's mind like ivy climbing a monastery wall. She sees reflection as corruption, a dangerous indulgence meant to distract from divine purpose. It's no coincidence that, as she ascends politically, her spiritual rigidity intensifies. You're watching now as she bans ornate jewelry from her lady-in-waiting's wardrobe, removes a polished bowl from the dining table, and orders devotional paintings placed exactly where her line of sight naturally lands, never a reflection, always an image anchored in purpose. Historical fact. During her reign, Isabella promoted a revival of Catholic orthodoxy that leaned heavily into self-denial and religious purity. Her policies sowed the seeds for the Spanish Inquisition, and her intense piety became a defining trait of her legacy. But here's your quirky tidbit: a monk visiting from Andalusia noted that the Queen refused a silver reliquary shaped like a mirror, calling it an insult to the saints. That kind of reaction goes beyond modesty. Historians still argue whether Isabella's growing fear was symbolic of her statecraft, a tool to reshape feminine power into religious stoicism, or if something more visceral was at play. Theories abound: a disturbing reflection during grief, a whispered curse, a theological epiphany. None proven. What you do know is this: Isabella began to rewrite her personal environment like a holy text, removing reflective surfaces as one might remove serpents from a garden. You feel that shift, sitting with her as she reads scripture aloud, not to be heard but to drown out thought. Her voice is steady. The chamber quiet. And in that silence, you notice the oddest thing: her pupils seem not to take in the room, but to search for something that's no longer permitted. Not even a ripple. Not even a glimmer. The Queen is staring at nothing and hiding everything. You drift deeper into the folds of time, winding through the twisted alleys of medieval belief, where mirrors are not just tools but gateways. Now you're outside Isabella's chambers, tracing tales that swirl through the streets like incense, stories not just of vanity, but of danger. In towns across Castile, you hear whispers: a mirror left uncovered overnight might lure spirits, a child gazing too long could invite possession, shattered glass means your soul's been fractured. These aren't just peasant fears, they seep upward, into aristocratic halls and scholarly debate, muddying the line between superstition and doctrine. You step inside a scribe's study where a parchment scrawls notes on mirror properties, describing them not just as reflectors, but as traps, devices that might harbor the residue of what they capture. That idea sinks into your skin a little. You feel it crawling up the base of your neck as you recall Isabella's constant refusal to have mirrors in rooms where she slept. Too risky, she believed, for a soul to be exposed while dreaming. Historical fact. In 15th century Europe, particularly Spain, mirrors were often considered mystical. Some thought they could reveal truths hidden from the naked eye, others feared they might distort reality itself. Even scientific minds of the time hadn't settled on whether reflected light behaved naturally or was tainted by unseen energies. A fringe tidbit comes from a Catalan apothecary, who claimed his customers begged for mirrored flasks to catch luck if placed at the doorstep but warned never to bring one inside. You see how these beliefs danced around Isabella's mind, amplified by her devotion and personal fears. Historians still argue whether her aversion was a uniquely Castilian development or part of broader Christian mysticism. Some link it to the writings of Saint Hildegard of Bingen, who described reflections as echoes of pride. But the queen didn't just cite doctrine, she reshaped her chambers to make a point. No polished goblets. No glossy floor tiles. Even the silver of her dinnerware was dulled, beaten with tiny hammers to diffuse its sheen. You walk with her now through her dressing room, noticing a tapestry where you expect a mirror. On it, St. George slays the dragon, his sword shining faintly, but no reflection to be seen. The implication is clear: even victory must be humble. Even courage shouldn't gaze at itself. A royal decree? No. But what you're seeing is something stronger, a ritual of absence. An environment sculpted not with proclamations, but with refusal. And in that emptiness, the legend begins to take root. You're seated just outside the Queen's curtain dressing alcove now, fingers brushing the edge of a velvet stool as hushed voices filter through the fabric. Court ladies 6, maybe 7 of them are deep in conversation, though it's hardly the kind of idle chatter you'd expect. They're murmuring about the missing mirror again. One claims Isabella had hers removed after a rosary snapped mid-prayer during a glance in its reflection. Another swears the Queen saw her own face shimmer into that of her late mother during a sleepless night. You listen as each woman leans in a little closer, matching whispers with wide eyes and jittery laughter that doesn't quite feel amused. Rumors travel fast here, but they don't die easy. It's been years since anyone saw a mirror in the Queen's chamber, and now it's become taboo to even mention it aloud in certain circles. One maid was reportedly dismissed for bringing a polished brooch that caught the light too precisely. Another, you hear, was transferred to the kitchens after trying to restore a smoky mirror tucked behind a chapel curtain. Gossip evolves into ritual, into quiet rules everyone follows without fully understanding. Historical fact. At the Castilian court under Isabella, decor and daily customs grew increasingly austere, a reflection of her spiritual discipline. Even visiting foreign dignitaries made note of the plainness in personal quarters, though the public halls glittered with riches. Your fringe tidbit tonight involves a robe one ordered by the Queen for ceremonial use, stitched with silver thread that never quite caught a gleam. It had been woven intentionally to diffuse light, to avoid any unholy flicker. Historians still argue whether Isabella's mirror ban created a ripple effect in noble society or merely reflected her own quirks. But by now, you're seeing imitation. Courtiers removing reflective panels. Tapestries covering polished furniture. Even visiting princesses beginning to copy the decor, citing religious modesty, though you sense a hint of trend chasing buried underneath. You peek now through the curtain, catching Isabella at her writing desk, and there's something strange about the way she sits, never facing the window's glass, always angled just away. It's as if she believes the world offers illusions, and only shadows can be trusted. You feel the air shift thicker, quieter, more reverent. This isn't superstition anymore. It's culture. And from within that curtain, she rewrites the rules of feminine power, one unspoken ritual at a time. You slip into the shadowed gallery now where the royal portraits hang. Isabella's predecessors stare out in oil and pigment, each rendered with the unmistakable gleam of a mirror's truth behind the artist's brush. But then you reach her own likeness, and something's missing. The light in her eyes isn't mirrored, the jewelry dulled, and the background suspiciously absent of reflective surfaces. Even her coronation painting shows her gazing slightly away, never quite meeting herself. This isn't a coincidence. You turn to her relationship with Ferdinand, and suddenly you realize there's more at play than royal taste. The tension between husband and wife runs deeper than statecraft. Ferdinand, pragmatic and politically flexible, never shared Isabella's fear of mirrors. In fact, historical record shows his own chambers contained Venetian glass, a commodity prized for its clarity and accuracy. You watch as he offers her one, casually, during their early years of marriage. She accepts it with a stiff smile, thanks him, and then, quietly, has it stored in the cellar. You trace their arguments over court design. Ferdinand requests brighter windows, she wants narrower slits with gauze drapes. He proposes a fountain in the garden with a polished basin, and she insists on clay. It becomes symbolic, this reflective divide between them. Your quirky tidbit here? During a diplomatic banquet, Ferdinand reportedly gave a toast beside a silver goblet that caught his reflection mid-sentence. Isabella looked away so sharply she dropped her fan. That fan, by the way, lined with tiny silk threads woven to dull shine. Historians still argue whether the mirror disagreement represented a schism in their religious approach, Isabella upholding ascetic spirituality, Ferdinand favoring presentation and perception in diplomacy. Their marriage survived, but court insiders noted how rarely they dined alone. You sit with them now at a velvet-covered table. The candle flames sway, and Ferdinand gestures animatedly about trade routes, naval fleets, alliances. Isabella nods, but her eyes never flicker toward the polished decanter between them. She drinks from a ceramic cup, plain and unpainted. The wine glows, but never reflects. Even her silence feels intentional. Over the years, Ferdinand's chambers remain bright, angular, reflective. Isabella's grow darker, layered, absorbing. And somewhere in that contrast, a kingdom finds balance. But for the Queen, you sense dissonance, not marital, but moral. Because the world wants to be seen, and she keeps trying to hide from it. You follow Isabella now into the narrow passageways behind the main chapel, where the scent of frankincense still clings to the stones and the walls seem to listen. It's here, in the soft hush of confession, that the Queen reveals what the polished world never hears. You're crouched near a lattice screen, invisible to her, and you catch fragments, quiet admissions, pressed in Latin, whispers of guilt that weigh heavier than royal crown work. There's one phrase that surfaces more than once: speculum peccati, the mirror of sin. The words hang in the air like incense. You feel their weight. The priest says little, only nodding with slow gravity. You notice how the Queen speaks of visions, brief flashes in dark glass, images that didn't match her own face. Sometimes, she says, she saw her mother, pale and trembling. Other times, she swore she glimpsed herself aged and dying, though no one else saw anything at all. And once, though her voice trembles as she says it, she thought she saw someone behind her. But she was alone. These aren't confessions of crime. They're confessions of fear. You recognize the shift from spiritual doctrine to emotional vulnerability, a ruler unraveling in private. Here's your historical anchor: Isabella's religious practice was intense and layered with mysticism. She held frequent private masses, practiced long fasts, and maintained personal confessions even when public appearances demanded strength. Her confessors were trusted, but rarely recorded her words. That privacy, however, didn't keep the rumors out. A fringe detail floats up from a monk's diary who once claimed to hear the Queen mutter about mirrors calling back what should not return. The entry was scratched out later, but not before someone copied it. Historians still argue whether Isabella suffered from religious visions, hallucinatory grief, or just an intensely symbolic imagination. The fact that her spiritual language became tangled with reflective imagery is no longer debatable. It shaped her space, her rituals, her fears. You walk with her now along the marble floor back to her chambers, the candle she carries flickering against the polished brass hinges of a door, and you see her turn slightly, deliberately, so the light doesn't catch her face. The gesture is subtle, automatic, as if the ghost of a mirror still lingers in her mind's periphery. And just before the door closes, she pauses, like she expects something behind her to move. But nothing does. Except maybe your breath. You walk beside Isabella now under the arches of C. Redoba, your steps echoing softly against mosaicked marble floors once pressed by caliphs and poets. The city breathes with layers of history. Muslim, Christian, Jewish, and glass glints subtly in windows where Moorish artisans carved filigree into light itself. You sense tension growing behind her eyes. For Isabella, Al-Andalus represents both cultural marvel and spiritual threat. Its legacy of beauty, especially in mirrors and decorative glass, unsettles her. You feel it as she approaches a merchant stall selling Venetian imports, a mirror encased in gold leaf with a ruby clasp. The vendor gestures proudly, but Isabella recoils ever so slightly, then moves on without a word. This isn't snobbery. It's something deeper. You find yourself trailing her through the palace wing recently reclaimed from the Nasrid dynasty. And here's your historical fact: after the Reconquista, Isabella reclaimed Muslim territories, and many of their artisans remained under Christian rule, contributing to Castilian architecture, textiles, and yes, mirrors. Their work was renowned, marked by intricate designs and spiritual symbolism. But Isabella began quietly removing reflective elements from renovated chambers. Her advisors thought it a matter of taste. You know better. A fringe detail emerges from a ledger dated 1483, a mirror purchased by a court official in Granada was mysteriously scratched, then returned with a note saying, "Not suitable for Her Majesty's sight." The story was buried, like the mirror itself. Historians still argue whether Isabella viewed Moorish glasswork as spiritually incompatible or if a particular incident in Alhambra spurred her aversion. Some scholars suggest she may have encountered something unsettling in one of the prayer niches, where mirrors were said to mimic heavenly light. You follow her into a garden courtyard, where the breeze dances across a fountain. A servant lifts a polished bowl toward her. She waves it away with barely a glance. Even nature's reflection isn't safe anymore. And beneath this surface discomfort, a broader unease begins to ripple. Isabella's spiritual conflict with Al-Andalus doesn't just involve religion. It involves beauty itself, the kind of beauty that looks back. And as you trace her fingers brushing along the edge of a curtain embroidered with lunar patterns, you realize something quietly terrifying. She fears that the mirrors of Al-Andalus don't just reflect the soul, they multiply it. You're tracing the edges of a story now, one that no herald ever penned and no historian can quite verify, but which clings to the undercurrents of Isabella's court like wet silk. It begins with a chambermaid, young, bright-eyed, quietly curious, who was assigned to tidy one of the Queen's lesser-used rooms in the early summer of 1490. The space hadn't been opened in weeks, and the light spilling through the stained glass windows revealed a pale shimmer tucked under a velvet cloth, a mirror. A small one, forgotten or misplaced. You picture the girl hesitating, then lifting the cloth, heart quickening as she glimpses her own face for the first time in such clarity. But something goes wrong. Her scream isn't loud, but sharp enough to bring two guards running. By the time they enter, the mirror is broken face down, the glass splintered like a frozen lake, and the girl is shaking in a corner. She won't speak for days. When she finally does, she says she saw someone else's face. Not her own. Not the Queen's. Someone she couldn't describe. That story never made it into the official records. But the room was permanently sealed. Furniture removed. The mirror? Never seen again. Historical fact. That room existed, it appears, in old architectural plans of the Alcazar, but was omitted from later renovations. Court servants referred to it as La Cimara Muda, the mute chamber. Your fringe detail now: one of Isabella's most trusted maids reportedly vanished from service not long after the incident. Some said she joined a convent. Others whispered she fled to Era again under a different name. Historians still argue whether this event even occurred, or whether it was spun into legend by frightened staff and curious scribes. But you walk the corridor now, and you feel it. That chill. That hush. A fear that doesn't speak in words but in absences. A mirror once stood here. Now, there's nothing. Not even a portrait. Just empty stone, draped in velvet silence. Isabella never spoke of the event. But from that year forward, no servant entered her private quarters with any object that could shimmer. Not a polished tray. Not a glazed pot. Instructions were unspoken, passed through glances and silent nods. You look back once, down that hallway, and you could swear it turns darker the longer you watch it. Like something still waits there. Watching you. But unseen. You wander now through the corridors of judgment, where Isabella's spiritual anxieties bleed outward into policy. The mirror ban doesn't just remain a private preference, it begins creeping into matters of law and punishment. You're present during the early years of Spain's witch trials, a time when the fear of vanity and self-deception becomes weaponized. The courtroom isn't lined with mirrors, naturally. In fact, one inquisitor remarks that no sinner should face their own gaze during confession, and you sense the idea spreading: reflection implies duality, and duality implies danger. Isabella doesn't oversee trials personally, but her influence hangs heavy. You learn she favored inquiry into female heresy over male, citing their susceptibility to temptations of the eye. That line alone sits like a pebble in your shoe. It never quite goes away. A historical fact presses in: during Isabella's reign, the Spanish Inquisition solidified its power, focusing heavily on rooting out heresy, especially practices tied to personal adornment, divination, and mirror use. Women were disproportionately accused, especially those labeled vain, secretive, or unnaturally reflective. A fringe tidbit surfaces in an inquisitor's ledger: one woman arrested in Seville had 22 small mirrors hidden in her home. Each one catalogued. Each one shattered in court. Historians still argue whether this trend of targeting reflective objects stemmed from broader Christian doctrine, or whether Isabella's private practices subtly bled into judicial culture. You sit now at the edge of a candlelit tribunal, watching as a girl barely 17 is questioned for having polished pewter on her vanity. The room is quiet, except for the crackle of flame. You notice a pattern in the accusations: mirrors aren't just props, they're evidence. Suggestive of unnatural practices. Symbolic of pride. Punishable. Isabella doesn't appear, but her absence feels loud. The judges reference her reforms, her court's example. You realize now that her mirror ban has grown fangs not by decree, but by imitation. Like a rumor turned law. You walk with a scribe later, past the shattered remains of confiscated glass, and you can't help but wonder, how many souls were judged not for crimes committed but for light caught wrong in their eyes. You're standing in the western wing of the palace now, surrounded not by gilded mirrors or polished bronze, but by oil paintings layered, lush, and hauntingly still. Isabella glides past them like they're old friends, each brushstroke a deliberate substitute for reflection. It hits you: she's replaced mirrors with portraits. Not entirely as vanity, but as control. Unlike mirrors, paintings don't change. They don't ripple or shimmer or twist a face depending on light. They're frozen, curated, edited to her liking, sealed with the artist's brush. You watch as she studies an image of the Virgin Mary: soft eyes, hands folded, no shine to the fabric, just matte reverence. You see her pause and nod. You realize, then, how much she prefers symbolism to raw accuracy. Historical fact to ground you: Isabella commissioned numerous religious artworks during her reign, many meant not just to decorate but to instruct. These weren't casual adornments, they carried moral weight. Often placed in private quarters, the art she allowed in was chosen for its message and emotional resonance, not its realism. A fringe detail trickles in from a painter's letter to his apprentice: he was told not to use glossy pigments in any commission for the Queen, as the soul must see truth, not shimmer. That's a pretty rare demand in the world of oil painting, and it tells you plenty. Historians still argue whether Isabella's use of art to mask her discomfort with mirrors was strategic or psychological. Was she curating her surroundings to maintain her religious image, or did she genuinely fear the unpredictability of reflection? You notice something else too. The Queen never poses for portraits herself unless absolutely necessary. When she does, she chooses angles that avoid front-facing realism. You examine one up close, and even the irises seem just a touch blurred, as if the painter softened them on purpose. Whether by accident or design, the Queen's image always feels a little unreal. You follow her into an adjoining room now, one lined with devotional icons instead of portraits. Each glows dully in candlelight. No shine, no gleam. And you get this eerie sense that Isabella believes painted faces are safer than her own. They hold a holiness she might lose if she ever saw herself clearly. Paintings don't challenge her. Mirrors might. And that's a difference she refuses to risk. You find yourself seated beside a collection of weathered scrolls and bound manuscripts now, tucked deep within the royal library's most guarded alcove. The scent of vellum and ink wraps around you like incense, and you follow Isabella's fingertips as they skim through treatises written by monks, theologians, and philosophers, each exploring the symbolic weight of mirrors in Catholic thought. One passage stands out: Speculum Dei, the mirror of God. According to some religious scholars, to gaze into a mirror was to seek divine understanding of oneself. But others warn that this act bordered on arrogance, a human mimicry of omniscience. Isabella lingers over these pages, her expression tightening. She's not searching for beauty, she's hunting sin disguised as clarity. You read over her shoulder, noting that reflections were considered both illuminating and corrupting, like spiritual fire, capable of warming the soul or burning it down. Historical fact to anchor you: in late medieval Catholic doctrine, mirrors were often used as metaphors for moral introspection. St. Augustine referenced them in sermons, Thomas Aquinas discussed them as philosophical instruments. But there was tension: they could also symbolize deceit, illusion, false pride. A fringe insight glimmers from a 15th century Spanish friar who believed mirrors were fit only for angels or beasts, never man, for he is neither pure enough to reflect grace nor wild enough to ignore what he sees. A sentiment that sounds tailor-made for Isabella's spiritual worldview. Historians still argue whether she absorbed this doctrine passively or actively shaped her religious environment around it. Her chambers were redesigned not just for comfort but for theology. Windows shifted to indirect light. Prayer rooms oriented away from anything shiny. Even devotional relics were selected based on opacity rather than adornment. You move with her to a small altar now, watching her trace the edge of a statue not glossy, but carved in matte wood. Her lips move silently, and though the statue has eyes, it does not reflect hers. She finds peace there. That's what you're beginning to understand: Isabella feared self-recognition that lacked divine mediation. And mirrors? They skipped the messenger. They showed her too plainly. Too dangerously. To her mind, God should reveal the soul, not glass. So she closes the manuscript. The dust swirls. And somewhere in that quiet, a doctrine becomes a decree. You drift now into the Queen's most intimate chamber, where the walls no longer boast carved stone or regal murals but tapestries thick, woven, and meticulously chosen. Each thread tells a story, but none offer reflection. The room pulses with color: deep wine, soft gold, muted sea green. You trail your fingers along a hanging cloth depicting a scene from the Psalms: sheep clustered under divine light, their eyes turned away from water. There's something hauntingly deliberate about these choices. Isabella didn't just remove mirrors. She replaced them with symbolism. Everywhere. What you begin to realize is that her identity, her sense of self, is being reassembled in fragments of cloth, brushstroke, and ritual. You note how the tapestries distort perspective slightly. Trees lean sideways. Faces lack symmetry. It's not because the artists lacked skill. They were instructed to do so. Historical fact for you: Castilian tapestries during Isabella's reign leaned heavily into didactic design, art that taught, warned, preserved story but rarely sought realism. Her patronage encouraged distortion, as if truth was meant to be filtered. Your fringe tidbit tonight is one of her most infamous hangings, a crimson tapestry featuring Saint Cecilia standing beside a veiled mirror. Only the veil is embroidered in gold. It gleams more than the glass. The message isn't subtle. Historians still argue whether Isabella used tapestries as religious armor, a buffer against the spiritual risks of reflection, or whether she saw them as acceptable illusions, controlled, curated, holy. You sit with her now beside a hearth, watching the fire light dance on her sleeve but never catch on her skin. She reads aloud from a leather-bound book, her voice steady, her eyes deliberately drifting past a polished wine pitcher placed too close to the flame. A servant notices, removes it silently. That, too, has become ritual. You realize now how warped identity can become when reflection disappears, not lost, but stretched across symbols. Isabella's room feels like memory stitched, bent, filtered through her faith. And in this patchwork sanctuary, she begins to forget what her own face once offered. You lie back now in a quiet antechamber, tiled in faded hues and scented faintly of rosemary and parchment. A journal sits on a cushioned table beside you, its leather softened by years of touch. You open it slowly, flipping through neat but unpretentious handwriting, and you realize this is Isabella's private record, not court directives, not spiritual transcripts, but the internal landscape of a woman unraveling quietly. And you notice a theme. Dreams. Pages filled with them, some structured like poems, others fragmented like frost on glass. Nightmares mostly. And always, somehow, mirrors. You read a passage describing a dream of walking through her own palace, finding every room empty but filled with mirrors, hundreds, maybe thousands, all angled wrong. Her reflection absent. Another entry describes being surrounded by figures she recognized but whose faces shimmered like water, distorted and silent. The most chilling line? If I ever see her again, my reflection, I fear she will not speak. But she will move. Historical fact anchors you: Queen Isabella kept journals throughout her reign, though many were destroyed or hidden after her death. Surviving fragments show a woman deeply introspective, increasingly mystical, sometimes frightened. They suggest she believed dreams carried divine warning, and that the subconscious could be molded by prayer. Your fringe tidbit here comes from an archivist's commentary. One of Isabella's discarded pages contained a sketch rudimentary, childlike, of a shattered oval, labeled in Latin as oculus falsus falsi. Historians still argue whether her mirror-themed dreams stemmed from guilt, grief, or suppressed trauma. Was she haunted by visions of loved ones lost, or by a self she feared didn't align with her spiritual ideals? You follow her now through a twilight corridor. A servant offers a tray, metal, reflective. She declines. Another hands her a rose-colored glass cup with a textured finish. She drinks from it carefully. The dreams bleed into waking life. You watch as she moves through her rooms like someone avoiding puddles of thought. Even polished wood is dulled. Candlesticks are brushed with ash. A kingdom radiates in silver, but her world remains matte. And behind each act of refusal, you see it, a woman trying to keep her reflection from catching up. You stand now at the threshold of an ornate guest room, its walls kissed by the chill from Venetian stone, a gift delivered under diplomatic pretenses, but one that carries quiet tension. You peer through the archway and watch Isabella's eyes narrow at the sight of it, a mirror, large, dazzling, framed in glass filigree that seems to ripple like starlight. It arrived unannounced, a gesture of courtly generosity from Doge Agostino Barbarigo, supposedly symbolic of clarity and alliance. But to Isabella, it feels like intrusion. The room grows colder. You hear her murmur something beneath her breath, and the servants take immediate notice. The mirror is turned to face the wall within the hour. You're not surprised. This moment echoes a larger discomfort, an unspoken rejection of opulence disguised as diplomacy. Historical fact: Isabella maintained cautious relations with Venice, whose wealth and craftsmanship often clashed with her ideals of modesty and spiritual discipline. Gifts from Venetian envoys were scrutinized closely, sometimes declined altogether. The mirror, though? Too valuable to destroy. Too visible to keep. Your fringe tidbit here. A letter from a Castilian courtier revealed that the mirror had been initially intended for Ferdinand, but the Doge's messenger misread the palace alignment and placed it in Isabella's receiving quarters. Whether by accident or intent, the Queen's reaction changed the tone of future exchanges. Historians still argue whether the incident marked a diplomatic misstep or reinforced Isabella's spiritual boundaries. You sit now near a cluster of foreign guests, watching them glance sideways at the curtained wall. They've heard about the Queen's aversion. Some whisper, others scoff. One ambassador jokes that she fears her reflection will reveal too much. You catch Isabella's gaze briefly, and it's not annoyance. It's serenity. As if by removing the mirror, she's returned balance to the room. You feel it, too. A hush, a reprieve. The mirror is still there, hidden like a secret, resting silently behind embroidered fabric. But its presence reminds everyone that Isabella's world isn't shaped by political convention or foreign trinkets. It's sculpted by conviction. Even glass must obey. You stand beneath the scalloped archways of the Queen's redesigned East Wing now, where the very architecture speaks of avoidance. Unlike the ornate wings of neighboring courts, Isabella's quarters are shaped by an intentional kind of silence, a refusal not just of mirrors but of anything that dares bounce light. The walls are textured in matte stucco, soft ivory, without gloss. The tiles beneath your feet curve inward slightly to prevent shine. It's beautiful, in a dim and deliberate way. You notice how her chambers twist subtly at corners, creating angles where no reflection could catch. Even her candle holders are carved in clay, their surfaces rough enough to absorb flame. It's not designed for elegance. It's designed for protection. Here's your historical fact: late in Isabella's reign, several rooms within the royal palaces were remodeled not due to damage, but under religious advisement. Some of these changes included the removal of highly polished marble and the introduction of textured stone and muted pigments. The records describe it as aesthetic simplification, but that's a tidy phrase for what's really a spiritual recalibration. Your fringe detail? A visiting Florentine architect noted that Isabella's bedchamber had no angles that permitted reflective echo. He called it a soft cube of thought. Historians still argue whether these architectural changes were inspired by confessional revelations or merely a progression of the Queen's personal comfort. You know better. You see the mechanics of her belief system pressed into mortar. You trail your hand now across a curved alcove, where tapestries hang loosely and wall niches cradle unshiny relics. There's a statue of Saint Agatha, carved from honey-colored wood. Her eyes gaze down, but there's no gleam. And you understand, Isabella's world isn't just decorated to erase reflection. It's constructed to prevent accidental encounters. Even her bath chamber is tiled with worn ceramics and lit from above through sheer cloth, so even water doesn't reflect with clarity. The absence of glass has become a blueprint. And the blueprint? A shield. She doesn't live in rooms. She lives in a maze of intentional shadows, where the only thing reflected is restraint. You slip into the folds of folklore now, where fact and myth intermingle like threads in a forgotten robe. The air grows heavier here, not with incense or candle wax, but with stories whispered in kitchens and convents, tales that never made it to parchment but refused to disappear. You hear of mirror doubles, reflected selves that act out forbidden desires, speak truths the waking mind dares not utter. In Castile, they call them espectros gemelos, spiritual twins that appear only in glass. The belief wasn't confined to peasants. Even nobles muttered it behind fans. A girl once claimed her double warned her not to marry. A baker swore his own image smiled before him, but he wasn't smiling. These are not bedtime stories. They're warnings. Isabella knew them. Felt them. You trace her footsteps through a cloister garden now, where vines climb over shaded stone and priests debate metaphysics beneath fig trees. She passes without joining, her expression hard, purposeful. She's heard the rumors, that mirrors lie, that they tempt the soul to stray. Historical fact sits quietly behind this. Spain in the 15th century had rich traditions of folklore, particularly in rural and border regions. Catholic doctrine often absorbed these stories, reframing them as cautionary parables. Your fringe detail tonight? A manuscript from Salamanca describes mirror twins as agents of vanity and doom, and warns readers never to glance into reflective surfaces under moonlight. That kind of superstition doesn't fade easily. Historians still argue whether Isabella's spiritual choices were influenced by indigenous beliefs or whether her fear of mirrors was a personal superstition magnified by folklore. You follow her now into her meditation chamber, no windows, no glint. Just candlelight, tapestries, and a single basin of water covered by a linen cloth. You feel her pause near it. You sense her remembering. And for a moment, you swear the cloth flutters not from her breath, but something else. She steadies her hands. She whispers a prayer. And that basin stays covered. Always. Because she doesn't need to see her twin. She's already afraid that it knows more than she does. You drift quietly into the outer chambers now, where polished absence has become protocol. Isabella's mirror ban isn't just a private quirk anymore, it's echoing through the corridors of nobility, like a rule too powerful to ignore and too mysterious to challenge. You listen as courtiers whisper about redecorating, not for fashion, but fidelity. A baron removes silver trim from his study. A countess covers her vanity mirror with silk. Even visiting dignitaries bow to the custom, avoiding reflections within court walls not because they believe but because they fear standing out. The Queen has created not just an environment but a culture. One without glass. You notice how messages between noble families subtly adjust. Descriptions of wardrobe omit jewelry. Praise never touches on physical beauty. It's as if the realm has rewritten politeness itself to accommodate her unease. Historical fact to pin this: by the mid-1490s, noble estates affiliated with Isabella's inner circle adopted aesthetic restrictions in household design. Inventories show a marked decline in silver-plated fixtures, mirrored panels, and polished ceramics. Some attributed this to religious discipline. Others called it trend. Your fringe tidbit slips in through an archivist's margin note. A noblewoman reportedly requested a miniature portrait instead of a mirror for her dowry, citing Her Majesty's wisdom. That wasn't flattery. It was fear disguised as grace. Historians still argue whether this ripple effect was genuine belief or royal emulation. Was Isabella's influence purely spiritual, or did her preferences reshape social norms through obligation? You trail her through a hallway now as visiting nobles walk beside her. One glances briefly at a reflective bowl, but his gaze snaps back as Isabella's hand subtly covers it with a cloth. No words are spoken. But the message rings clear. You feel that eerie silence building again, the kind that turns absence into rule. You pass through chambers where mirrors once hung. Now only woven fabric sways gently. And in those threads, a kingdom learns that reflection isn't sacred. It's suspicious. Not by law, but by example. And that may be stronger. You stand now at the edge of a painter's studio, sunlight filtered through gauze as brushes whisper across stretched canvas. A new portrait is being prepared, one that must capture Isabella not just in form but in essence. And yet, the tension in the room is thick. The artist hesitates. Not with color, not with technique, but with philosophy. You feel it. The weight of trying to depict a woman who refuses reflection. How do you paint someone who won't face herself? You move closer, watching drafts scattered on the table, some too vivid, some too stylized. The compromise is clear: the painter must dull reality, soften symmetry, and avoid shine. Isabella's likeness will not glisten. Historical fact: presses in portraits of Queen Isabella notably lack the lifelike realism common in Italian Renaissance works. Spanish portraiture during her era leaned toward religious symbolism and rigid formality. Her images are iconic, not intimate. Your fringe detail today? A painter's personal account revealed that Isabella once ordered a sketch to be burned because the eyes looked too loud. Not bright. Loud. As if gaze itself was noise. Historians still argue whether this artistic restraint stemmed from modesty, theological influence, or psychological discomfort. You see it now in the studio: how the crown is outlined but not polished, how the robes shimmer less than the eyes of her saints. The portrait will be hung in the public hall, praised, examined. But it will not reflect. You walk with the painter to his final sitting. Isabella arrives quietly, seated beneath an icon of Saint Teresa. Her posture is composed. Her gaze never meets his. And as the brush moves across canvas, she speaks only once: "Make me as I serve, not as I seem." That line lodges in you. Because it isn't just instruction. It's doctrine. You leave the studio that day with a truth heavier than pigment: some people shape legacy not by what they show, but by what they forbid to be shown. You return now to the Queen's final years, where silence deepens and shadows settle into ritual. Isabella moves slower, her steps deliberate, her gaze more inward. The mirror ban is no longer questioned, its gospel. You walk with her through dim hallways softened by woven cloth and dusted stone, the air rich with rosemary and fading ink. Her chambers hold fewer guests, fewer decorations, and even fewer moments of reflection. You notice a silver plate brought by an attendant, its surface dulled by soot. She lifts her hand, not in anger, but quiet dismissal. It's wrapped and replaced before the servant bows. She doesn't speak. She doesn't need to. The rules have outlived the reasons. Historical fact grounds you: in Isabella's final years, her health declined alongside the pressures of empire building, the weight of conquest, and religious fervor. Her correspondence grew sparse, her ceremonial appearances rarer. Yet the spaces around her remained meticulously curated, free of anything that mirrored light. Your fringe detail now: a letter from a royal steward mentions the difficulty of locating unpolished objects for palace use, citing Her Majesty's strong preference and unwavering devotion. It was no longer just about fear or doctrine. It was identity. Historians still argue whether Isabella's mirrorlessness marked a spiritual triumph or emotional unraveling. But you stand now in her final chamber, where candlelight trembles softly across wooden saints and muted relics. No glass. No shimmer. Even the holy water sits still in clay. You watch her pray, her hands clasped, her breath slow. There's no sense of absence anymore, only intention. Her life has been carved around belief, stitched together by rituals that rejected reflection. And as she lowers her head, you realize something quietly monumental. In a world that prized beauty, clarity, and truth as seen, Isabella chose the unseen. Not because she lacked courage but because her truth could not be caught in a pane of glass. Only remembered. Only felt. Only feared. You step now into the realm of memory, where history stops recording and only stories remain. Isabella is gone. The throne has shifted. The court moves on, as it must, but her absence leaves a peculiar vacuum. You walk the same chambers now, under new light, surrounded by voices that sound confident but lack her gravity. And it's then you notice something strange. Mirrors begin returning. Not loudly. Not ceremoniously. Just slowly. A polished tray is used in a banquet. A window refracts moonlight instead of diffusing it. A foreign princess arrives with a silver comb and doesn't hide it. The ripple she created begins to smooth out. But not everywhere. There are rooms still left untouched. Spaces where time forgot to redecorate and fear remembered too well. You pass a linen closet repurposed into a prayer cell, where a maid insists the air turns cold if you speak aloud. You hear of one guest who removed a curtain, found nothing behind it and left before sunset. Historical fact to ground you: after Isabella's death in 1504, her daughter Joanna inherited portions of her influence, though her reign was marked by instability. The palace underwent renovations, some of which reintroduced reflective materials, mirrors, polished metals, Venetian glass. But never in the East Wing. Not once. A fringe anecdote emerges from a mason's notebook. He was instructed to replace tile in one chamber but told explicitly to avoid any surface that gathers light. He wondered if it was superstition or reverence. Historians still argue whether the remnants of Isabella's aversion endured out of loyalty or fear. You trace her legacy not in decrees but in habits, in servants who still wipe down polished knobs, in tapestries that remain unremoved long after the fashion changed. You sit on a bench in her favorite courtyard. The fountain now catches sunlight. But if you look closely, you'll notice something curious. The water reflects the sky, the leaves, the arches. But not you. Not exactly. And in that shimmer, in that near absence, you feel her. Not watching. Not judging. But whispering still. A legacy etched not in gold but in everything she chose to leave invisible. You stand now at the intersection of myth and memory, looking back through the lens of legacy, where Queen Isabella's mirrorless life has become more than just history, it's become parable. You hear storytellers spin her tale beside fires, not as a lecture on royalty, but as a whisper about a woman who refused reflection and shaped the soul of a kingdom instead. In dusty libraries, scholars still debate her policies and doctrines, but in quiet villages, children are told not to stare into still water after sunset lest the queen's silence gaze back. You walk the stone corridors of her influence, some restored, some untouched. In one alcove, a newly hung mirror gleams, but something about its presence feels too loud, too modern, too unaware. You look into it briefly and find your own eyes searching not for vanity, but for understanding. And perhaps that's her final lesson. Historical fact to frame it: Isabella's reign marked the beginning of Spain as a unified empire, a legacy steeped in conquest, culture, and contradiction. Her decisions changed continents, yet her personal rituals left invisible fingerprints on intimate spaces long after. Your fringe tidbit for this closing turn. A 19th century poet visiting Castile claimed he wandered into a chamber where no sound echoed, no light glimmered, and he found a single fragment of glass wrapped in velvet. He called it the Queen's ghost. Historians dismiss it. But it remains written. And now you trace her memory through choices, not objects, rooms where reflection is ritual or rejection. You understand that Isabella didn't fear mirrors merely for what they showed. She feared what they required: recognition, reckoning, return. You feel that now as you exit her world, the flicker of candlelight trailing behind. And maybe, just maybe, you notice that even the hallway mirrors seem duller. As if her silence touched them too. You pause now beside a quiet stream just beyond the palace grounds, where the surface catches moonlight in broken shards. You bend down, cautiously, curious not just about what you'll see but what you won't. The water trembles slightly, stirred by wind, and for a moment your face appears, blurred and unfinished. You remember everything: the velvet-covered mirror, the tapestries designed to erase truth, the silver trays rejected without a word. You've wandered through a world crafted by one woman's conviction, no, her fear, and shaped by absence with more power than presence. And still, this stream reflects you. Not because it dares to challenge, but because it doesn't know better. You feel the eerie duality of reflection and belief, of seeing and being seen. Historical fact. After Isabella's death, her mirror aversion was never formally codified, yet generations of Castilian nobility retained aspects of her taste. Decorative trends leaned toward opacity. Modesty became a virtue not just in dress but in decor. Your fringe detail tonight emerges from a traveling bishop's log dated 1528. He noted that while mirrors had returned to certain halls, the queen's shadow still curled softly along the floor. It's a poetic line. Possibly imagined. But it lingers. Historians still argue whether Isabella's mirrorless life was a singularity, a devout anomaly, or whether it seeded an entire aesthetic movement rooted in divine restraint. You walk away now from the stream, but the flicker of moonlight remains behind. You didn't see anything unnatural in your reflection. But perhaps that's the final mystery. Maybe the danger was never in the mirror. Maybe it was in the knowing that something might appear one day and ask, simply, why you chose not to look. You descend now into the quietest layer of memory, where Isabella's echo no longer speaks in words or rituals but in atmosphere. You're in a hallway renovated thrice since her time, yet the light still feels reluctant, hesitating before it touches the corners. A mirror hangs on one wall now, ornate and modern, framed in brass. You step toward it, curious. Your reflection greets you politely. But as you gaze, something flickers behind your thoughts, a question, a weight, a whisper from centuries ago. You remember what she taught you, that reflection isn't neutral. It's a choice. A challenge. A mirror may show your surface, but it demands your depths. Historical fact closes softly here. The last known personal item belonging to Isabella was a carved wooden rosary, smooth from use, no shine, no decoration. It's kept in a velvet-lined box within a monastery archive. Not on display. Protected not by glass but by faith. Your fringe detail arrives like a feather. One nun recorded that each time she opened the box, the chamber felt colder. But never threatening. Just still. Historians no longer argue. They wonder. They muse. They write with hesitation. Because what Isabella left behind wasn't absence, it was tension. You leave the hallway now, stepping into open air, moonlight brushing your shoulder. You carry her story not in mirrors but in how you think about them. About reflection. About what we dare to see and what we choose to unsee. And as the wind moves past, just gentle enough to ripple your sleeve, you realize something quietly powerful. Isabella didn't erase her reflection. She transformed it. Into legend. Into caution. Into you. The corridors are quiet now, draped in the hush that follows legend. You've walked alongside Isabella through shadowed ritual and vanished reflection, feeling the pull of stories that dared not shimmer. The palace is empty but still listening. The mirror stays turned. The tapestry breathes. And you carry the last candle. In this dim glow, the queen's silence is a kind of echo, not a warning, not a fear, but a legacy made of absence. You step forward, unseen by glass, felt only by memory. And with each stride, the tale folds itself into your breath. You're ready now.